applicable skills as John envisioned. We also seek inspiration from our keynote speakers and visionaries. And in that spirit, I think we're really lucky this year that Peter Slatin, John's brother, and a leader as well in disability inclusion, could be here to kick off this 20th year. Peter's path is fascinating and reflects how he wove advocacy into his many, many faceted career. And don't laugh. I learned last night that Peter was a painter. As he was losing his vision, he was painting. He was a commercial real estate broker, a writer, not broker. Okay. He had something to do with commercial real estate. A writer, an educator, an editor, a publisher, and always a world traveler. Whatever his current pursuit, Peter made it a principle to respect the writers, artists, creators that he worked among. And I feel that same privilege being able to work among all of you year after year at Access U. Peter told me that he started a magazine called Grid. It was a trade magazine to put together the perspectives of both architecture and real estate. And as he was telling me about it, I thought, oh man, could Austin use that? Because we're putting up so many buildings, but do they all have to be so ugly? Currently, Peter is the CEO of the consulting firm Slatin Group LLC. They provide education, training, and disability inclusion for internal management and HR performance, drawing their program design from the lived experience of disabled people. Peter is an original thinker, and I am pleased and grateful to introduce him to open John Slatin Access U for our 20th anniversary for 2023. Thank you, Peter. No, I'm right here. And you have a lavalier, so I'm going to turn my mic off and everyone says, thanks.
This my chair. No, that's not the chair. Aha. All right. Wow. This is Inga. Inga, have a seat. Cup of squat. As they say in the Bronx, cup of squat. Hey, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. It's hard for me to even say how excited, honored, and nervous I am. So thank you, Sharon and Nobility, for your generosity and bringing me here. Well, I'll tell you this. So this is, you're all here about digital accessibility, digital technology. And as you see, I'm up here without notes because my Braille, although I learned Braille when I was 60, my fluency is not such that I could read a speech. And of course, I can't see a speech. And I did my best to remember some things. But I think it's interesting that Braille remains a bedrock of blind literacy, and fortunately, technology now enables Braille reading, and the two are not mutually exclusive, which is terrific. And it's really nice to be with people who are working so hard to create digital inclusion. And so I'll just launch in here. John, my brother, as Sharon mentioned, he had leukemia and did a 3-year struggle with leukemia. And when he was very close to the end, and I was with him and children in Houston, he didn't say much. John, because of his illness, and really in part because of the treatment he had undergone, he had a lot of trouble speaking. His tongue was very thick in his mouth and his speech was slurred. He had a lot of trouble. He couldn't really stand. He no longer had the ability to balance. He couldn't control his arms. They flew around every which way if he tried to use them. And of course, he was blind. and he was a very, very bright person. So when he said my name, I knew he was going to tell me something important, or something important was going to be said. And so he turned to me and said, "Peter." I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you going to finish the book?" Now, John and I had never been talking about any book. And so I said, "What book?" John got pissed off. "The history of accessibility," he said. Exactly, that's how he felt. I'm like, what the hell? I am, John knew I was a writer, and writing, what did I write about? Architecture, design, commercial real estate finance, and occasionally I would write an article about universal design. But mostly I didn't write about accessibility. And yet I knew, what am I going to tell John? No? Nah, forget it. The hell with it. So I just said yes. And that settled that, except I knew this was not a book I could write. I didn't feel like I had the research chops or whatever. And it would take me away from my path and follow his path. And his path was an amazing path, but I had my own. And yet I thought of that exchange so often. Just a little bit more about John. He was, as I said, very smart. He was 2 years ahead of me. So of course, in school growing up, all our teachers would say to me, "Why can't you be more like John?" True story. John got perfect scores on his SATs, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Savage's Romance about the American poet Marianne Moore. That was his thesis at Johns Hopkins, where he got his PhD. And, I would come visit him here in Austin, and he seemed to be getting more and more into this computer stuff. And one evening I arrived here, and he couldn't stop talking about this stuff called hypertext and hyperlinks. And I'm like, what the hell is that? And he showed me something, and it seemed amazing, but I didn't know, I didn't know where it was going to go. And this was probably I would say it was probably the early 90s. So yeah, it was kind of strange. And then as time went on, I began to see that he was using something called, he had the Kurzweil reader, and I saw what that was. That was fascinating. And then he was using this program called JAWS. And I started to hear it. And I thought, well, at that time, John lost his vision more rapidly than I did. So he was effectively blind much sooner in his life than I was in mine. But he was using JAWS, and I figured I'm going to have to learn this at some point. So one afternoon at his house, I said, "Can I check that out?" And he said, "Sure." Well, he was grumpy. "I'm working, and so, but he said, "Sure." So I sat down, he gave me a few keystrokes, and I started out. And within a few minutes, I was stumped. And John was exasperated. He said, "Well, can I have that back now?" And I said, "Well, how long did it take you to learn JAWS?" He said, "Oh, about 10 minutes. So, I don't know, maybe he was exaggerating. Maybe it took him 20 minutes. I don't know. Anyway, so, another thing John did before me was started using a long weight cane. When I thought, well, he doesn't need that. We don't need that. What he was doing was showing me that and just showing everyone, he wasn't afraid to be called a blind person, which, and that was a huge lesson for me. Still took me a long time to come toward that. But he did, and he didn't worry about that. I don't know what drove him into the world of digital accessibility, whether it was a passion for disability justice, which no one called it back then, but that's a great word for it, great phrase for it, or whether it was just practical. He needed to get his work done, so all this other stuff was in the way of getting his work done. And so, like as the great problem solver he set about to solve that problem. So, as I said, that exchange really, really stuck with me for a long time. And, I am not a digital accessibility expert, but we're here to spend an amazing week learning about digital accessibility, learning more and more and more about it, and still finding that there's so much more to learn. Most people, when they think about accessibility, and of course, most people don't think about accessibility, but when they do think about it, they think about it in terms of physical accessibility and, architecture and design, and you folks in landscape design and public spaces, and you folks all know that there's still plenty of people that when you say web accessibility or digital accessibility, they go, what is that? What are you talking about? They don't know. Well, I happen to think there's a third dimension to accessibility. And that's where I put my focus. It's social accessibility. That's what I call it, social accessibility. I'm a very social guy. So what is social accessibility? It's the equal interaction between humans who have disabilities and humans who consider themselves to be able-bodied and or able-minded. That's, if you live with a disability, there's a wide gap between the way you view your life and the value of your life and the way many other people view your life. And social accessibility is a way to close that gap. And that's what I try to do in the work I do with hotels and hospitality organizations, attractions, civic organizations, wherever I can. So, but what's behind this vast gap? It's mindset of millennia, of the revulsion and fear, superstition, and pity, and just plain ignorance of people in cultures of all kinds, across all continents, whether in the fields of religion or education or healthcare, politics and governance, commerce. This wide gap persists. And though, the work we're all doing is changing that very slowly, but there's a long way to go. And what it's really about at bottom, I think, is this question of value. So the barriers that we face, the blockages we're trying to and working to disrupt, they represent society's profound refusal to acknowledge the humanity of disability. And in turn, that reflects society's denial of the relevance of disability to humanity. And so these are things we have to work so hard to break down. These are not insignificant barriers. And that's why I think social accessibility, without it, you can do all the work you guys do, the wonderful work you do, and people will still fail to understand what it's for. Why do we need it? Who can it serve? Web is right here. Isn't it for everybody? Without it, you can have a beautiful physical space and it can be completely accessible. But if someone speaks to you in a patronizing or condescending way, pats you on the head, grabs you by the arm, starts pushing your wheelchair, or ignores you because you talk funny or sound different, it doesn't matter what the space is like. It doesn't matter whether their website says all kinds of things about accessibility. If they cannot recognize your shared value, your shared equal value, then you will remain in isolation. And, COVID-19, when it arrived on the scene, we began hearing a lot about just the pain of isolation that people feel. And these are people who have spent been working in offices and other places of other workplaces, schools, wherever, and it's a very real feeling. And what it did for me was say, welcome to my world, because certain kinds of disability, I think all disabilities, no matter how much you are loved and appreciated and welcomed, there is still sometimes a feeling of isolation that comes over because you're left out of something somewhere. And what that says to me is that, again, this is part of the world we're given. And we will keep working to chip away at that. It's a long, long slog. I think the history of accessibility that John, I'm sure, wanted me to write, and that he envisioned and wished he could write, but knew he did not have the time. The truth is, it's, as you all know, it's still in its infancy. I don't care what dimension we're talking about. And, just like society in general, we don't know where it will go, where the end is, et cetera, but we have a long way to go. I recently was on a panel in beautiful Brooklyn, New York, hosted by the Brooklyn chapter of the American Institute of Architects. And the panel was called Good Trouble, the Design of Integration. And in preparing for this panel, I noticed that one of my fellow panelists had written a book called The Architecture of Disability. And his name is David Gisson. He's an above-the-knee amputee and a runner and an architect and an architectural historian. And I got the book on Bookshare, yay Bookshare, and I read it, and it is written by an architect. And if there are any architects in this room, I'm sorry, you speak in architecture, speak. It's really dense, but nonetheless, this book was exhilarating. It was hard to read, but it was exhilarating because of just the richness of David's ideas and research and what he had to say. But the thing that struck me as I dove into the book was I'm going to keep talking. He started telling us about the Acropolis in the 5th century BCE. And he wrote how the approach to the Acropolis was a series of broad, gently sloping, packed earth ramps so that people could approach the Acropolis on foot, of course, people of all kinds and all abilities, not different abilities. We won't use that phrase, people with disabilities, but people in crutches, veterans, blind people, pregnant people, people of all kinds who needed older people, frail older people. Everyone could go and worship together because at least they recognized that this was a place of worship for everyone. Maybe not the slaves, I don't know. However, and don't get me wrong, this is not to say that the Greeks were a disability-loving society. They had the same revulsion about disability that persists today. Nonetheless, they had this exceptional approach to the Acropolis. Well, that was destroyed in the 1st century when the Romans came in and did their Roman thing. And, eventually nothing much happened. In the early 19th century, it was recognized that the Acropolis should be an archaeological site, and there were some interventions begun. And at some point in 2004, so we're flashing forward a lot of centuries here, well, Athens was hosting the Olympics. So somehow they realized, people might want to go to the Acropolis who aren't supposed to go there, but there's this thing called the Paralympics. I don't know if that's what started it, but anyway, some elevators were inserted, but the path that had been designed for the contemporary approach to the Acropolis started out nice and broad, but instead of opening up to a broad plain, it led into a series of switchbacks, climbing steeply and narrowing and funneling people into single file approaching the Acropolis so they could view it with awe. And it was a change, you know. So now there's, you know, you can take elevators, or you can, and David wrote that he climbed this path. It was very difficult, probably not possible in a wheelchair. So there are elevators that were, the first elevator was like a hoist, you know, a construction elevator. So there's the Acropolis. Now it's perched on its limestone cliffs, very craggy. And I've never been there, but I hope to get there someday. So anyway, what this story illustrates is that what happened, the latter day solutions to inaccessibility are what Gisson called, and I can't possibly disagree with them, they're technical solutions. That's fine. What do you do when you remediate a website that is inaccessible? You provide technical solutions. Because the vision of that website, the vision of a place, an Acropolis, that doesn't take into account accessibility at its fullest is incomplete. And so you have to solve that through technical intervention that is going to be in some ways at odds with the original intent of the designer and whoever's vision that website or space was. Oh, by the way, I neglected to mention that in the early 19th century, to make way for the Acropolis, the archaeological site of the Acropolis, it was designated as such, a newly reascendant Greek society, the area had been settled by Ottomans who were in control of Greece. Well, the Greeks, you know, took care of that. They got rid of the Ottomans. Many were slaughtered and killed, and you know, they cleared the site of the Ottoman villages that had sprung up. So I'm going to flash forward again to a contemporary, a modern day, a present day parallel. Not quite as bloody, or it's not bloody at all. It's not quite as brutal. No slaughter was involved. But in New York City, to make way for the creation of a temple of arts and culture, an entire neighborhood called San Juan, peopled by Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, brown and black people, was cleared, evicted, displaced. And Lincoln Center was erected and opened in 1966. And over the years, many interventions have been made to make Lincoln Center accessible. And I will say that Lincoln Center has really worked hard to make not only its places accessible, but its performances. As for its website, you guys will have to judge that. It could use some help. So, you know, my whole point about that is just, again, it's about the vision, about where did it start? Where is that vision, and how do we get there? How do we get people to stop thinking of accessibility as an afterthought? When I speak to architects, and now I'm speaking to you, and when I speak to web designers, but I don't usually get invited to speak to them, but I say, architects, okay, you use form as a driver of design. You use light as a driver of design. You use space and shape and volume and location, the context, architectural context, urban context. But you don't use accessibility. You don't think about accessibility. Accessibility becomes as, again, something about compliance. Let's comply with it. Well, you all know here, compliance is the floor, not the ceiling of where to go. So if you make accessibility a design driver, then you will see how vision can change. And I want to do that with society. That's, you know, I'm not doing it alone. What I'm thrilled about is that when I started doing what I do now, and social accessibility, I would hear, well, we don't need that here because nobody comes here with a disability. And that was somewhat true, but I like to say that this generation, the generation millennials and Gen Zers, this is the first generation in history that was born into a place where the rights of people with disabilities are guaranteed by law. What a revolutionary change. And someday they'll even enforce it. But that's what it's about. It's about changing our mindsets, the mindset of the world, to understand that people with disabilities have equal value, that the effort it takes to create accessibility, instead of the current thought that the people who will benefit aren't worth the effort, and they're not worth the effort because we see them as valueless, and they're valueless. Why? Because they require access. So that sets into motion, and that's, we call a vicious circle, but it's true. And whether you're talking to to a developer of a building, an ugly building, or a beautiful building, or the developer of a website, the organization behind the website, what are they going to say when you say we need it to be accessible? They're going to say, well, that costs too much, and the investment that we put into that is not matched by the number of people who will use it. It's just, it doesn't, as they say in real estate finance, it doesn't pencil out. Now, of course, that is not only is it an important moral condition, to put it like that, but it's also bad arithmetic, of course, and we know that. And it's not just, of course, people with disabilities who want that accommodation. Those of you who have had parents, and I bet you all have had parents and will have parents and do have parents, and grandparents. People get older, which is wonderful, and they begin to notice that they're not seeing as well, or hearing as well, walking as well, thinking as well, but they don't think of themselves as having disabilities. They're just older, and that's what happens to us as we get older. We lose some facility, some capability. So, in essence, it does pencil out. The more you make the world available to everyone, instead of designing for the world like you'd like it to be, like you'd think that it is, designed for the world as it is, and it's with humans all over it. This brings me back. I was talking about cost. Recently, I got a call from a client. I've worked with a major attraction in New York City, and I was there. And what I do is I work with my clients, and I do a number of things. But one of the things I do is I train their customer-facing staffs how to serve their guests with disabilities, how to value them, how not to do things like ask them, well, what happened to you? Or say, as someone said to me as he was guiding me around, he was laughing, and I said, what's funny? He said, you're my first blind date. Yeah, so I do that kind of training. And I do mention to them that they should think about digital accessibility. And so they called me in January and said, well, we were thinking about digital accessibility, and we heard about this product, and they did name the product, but I'm not going to name it here. But it was an overlay. And I said, thank you. So I said, well, that's a wonderful idea. And they're wonderful ideas, and they'll get you somewhere, but at the very moment you need it, it will desert you. It won't work for you. and they couldn't understand it. And so I sent them articles, and I sent them articles, lots of articles there. You can find many articles about what's wrong with overlays. I sent them articles and lists and the overlay fact sheet, yes. And thank you. And, you know, and I gave them the names of Nobility, gave them Sharon's name and a number of other organizations, because I felt like, okay, you need to choose. And they called around, and I don't know what happened. They went away talking about that. So that was in January. Well, 3 weeks ago, maybe 2.5, they called me again. You know, we'd love to talk to you again about that product. And could you find time for a call? Well, sure, I could find time. I did find time. Got on the call, and we had the same conversation. Exactly the same conversation. Now, I know this organization and I know their CEO. It's a very behind it. It's a $1 billion company, and he's a penny pinching guy. He's a control freak. That's all great CEOs are. But anyway, so I knew they weren't acting, they were following orders, you know. But I was still trying to make it clear to them that this wasn't going to work. And now one of the members of this team that was talking to me is not a native English speaker. And she has a thick accent, but she's very fluent at English. And I had a thought. I said, you know, would you prefer to speak to me in your native tongue and let Google Translate do the work to communicate with me? And she thought about it, and she said, you know, now I get it. And, you know, this is about communication, right? Shared language, because it's about shared language. And that's what at heart, what at bottom, we all need. We share language, and then we can share understanding. You know, and I say sharing language. This is social accessibility at base. It's a shared language, shared understanding, and we can share our access to the world. So to poorly paraphrase, I'll say, the arc of disability justice is long, but it bends toward accessibility, but it won't bend there by itself. Thank you.
Peter, do you want to take questions?
Yes, I do. If there are any, but I want to, where's my water? Where's my water? There it is. Thank you. Or comment. You can, or a spitball.
Thank you.
Tell me who you are, please.
Sure, I'm Seda Mauer. I'm a digital accessibility consultant. I'm a student of Sharon, and I'm so glad to be here and hear your speech. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
My question is, I am involved with a community facility that is not accessible, and I feel so torn with the fact that it's a religious oriented community, but the facilities are not accessible. And I was told when I questioned it is because it's a private facility. It doesn't have to be accessible. What are your thoughts on why are we still there where
Is it
something
so private? Is it so private that if I went there, they could say you can't come in?
No, it's not.
Then it's a place of public accommodation. They have
Thank you.
they're wrong. And whether, you know, I don't know if she's here tonight, but there's a wonderful attorney who will be here this week, Eve Hill. Eve, yay, so nice to see you. Maybe she can answer this question better than I can, if she would like. free advice. Go ahead.
Hello, this is Boughton Jones, Bouton Jones. You probably don't realize this, but halfway through your speech, the lights went out.
That's good.
Yeah, I thought it was a master stroke.
I had nothing to do with it,
Okay.
but I'll tell you a story. When I was getting my first guide dog in August of 2003, we all, we would go into, this was in upstate New York, and we would go into White Plains and train with the dogs. And then we'd go back to the school. So we went back to the school. This happened to be the night that all the lights went out on the East Coast. There was from the Midwest to the East Coast, there was a huge blackout, and the instructors went kind of frantic. And we were like, enjoy, it was very funny. Anything else?
My name is Dax Castro, and I'm a digital accessibility trainer. I think it's an interesting point that you brought up, that we are in this age where cost is the differentiator between whether we do something or not. And I think on the positive side, though, someone else had pointed out, there's never been a more amazing time to be a person with a disability than today's age, with the freedom that our cell phones give us. I go to CSUN every year, and it's amazing to me to watch it is affirming for me to see the physicality of what I do and the impact of accessibility on the community at large. And I think back to the times where when people had disabilities, they were locked away. It was the burden on the community was too great.
But they, well, thank you. And I totally agree with you that this is a better time than ever before for people with disabilities. But there's still so much to do.
So much. Absolutely. I think we are so far at the beginning of that road. But I think it's so encouraging that we have the technology and the process there.
Yes.
We just have to spread the word and get people to
thank you
care.
for checking me. I can get kind of a little bleak, but I am positive too. But which is why I do what I do. But it's really so important to keep pushing.
Absolutely. 100%.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? All right.
So Peter will be here all week, and I think most of you will be.
Thank you.
So let's find more opportunities to keep this conversation going. I'm really looking forward to hearing our other keynote speakers and all the trainers and just this community. This is my favorite time of year. I love May when we all come together. So thank you all again for being here. Oh, Anne has a question or a comment.
It's wonderful.
Who's that?
It's Ann Forrest. I had the pleasure of doing an internship with your brother, John. And just being here is making me very emotional because I miss him so much. So I really appreciate sort of you telling us where he directed you forward 20 years. And I wonder if you would say any thoughts you have about what John would think
About where we are?
about where we are. Yeah.
I think John would very much echo the comments of, I'm sorry, the last gentleman who spoke. And he would be more in love with this community than he ever was. I mean, and he already was, but he would just be more, and he would be amazed at how big this little community is. And, I began to learn about how big it was when I started going on Twitter and following people and seeing, oh my God, it's all over the place. My friends are getting jobs at banks and hotel companies, going through all their web pages and making them accessible. And this didn't happen before, you know, it just wasn't there, wasn't in the cards. So many things are available to us that weren't. So I think John would be really happy. And I just want to say a couple more things. I said I tried to memorize this speech, but I just want to shout out to John. Had 3 loving communities here in Austin. None, and wasn't a community, but his family was really what made life wonderful for him. His wife, Anna, I'm sure some of you know her. And she was there with him every day through his illness. And when she couldn't be there, she made sure someone was. She made sure he didn't have to eat hospital food. So he had his family. He had his UT colleagues, academics, professors from the rhetoric department of rhetoric and elsewhere. He had his ecstatic dance community that he and Anna were full court press participants in it. They loved that. And I was privileged to go in his place many times when I would visit. And that was overwhelming. And then, of course, he had this community. And I think this is what really drove him. And I remember seeing all 3 communities when I entered his hospital room for the first time, just a couple days after his diagnosis. And there he was in this full hospital room. There's not supposed to be a full hospital, but there was a lovely young woman massaging his arm. There were some colleagues from UT, and there were the Judge brothers, Jim and Jim. And they were talking about this thing, the WCAG, and like, you know, that was just another thing I was clueless about, but it was just incredible to be there and feel the enormous love that was around him, and to be here again and feel it. So thank you all. Oh. And thank you, Sharon, and Sharon. So. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. All right. I want to sit. I want a beer. What's that? Hey. Hello.
I'll find you.
Thank you for coming.
That was great. That was really great.
Wow. Yeah. Hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Here, there's this. You know Lydia, yes, Sharon?
Oh, yes, we had dinner together.
That was so fun. My name is Sam. Hey, Sam. Nice to meet you.